Welcome back. We are glad that you joined us today as we are continuing on our series called Thriving in Community. We're actually on part 2 now, which is about attachment love. And we're just going to maybe go back and review what the series is all about. So we're sort of basing this on a parable that Jesus told that you would probably know as the parable of the 4 soils. It's found in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the 4 soils are the path, the rocky soil, the weedy soil, and the good soil. And this series focuses on the good soil, or what it takes for God's word to take root in our lives and produce a harvest, or sometimes referred as fruit in the Bible. And in church language, we would call that discipleship. So Michael Hendricks and Jim Wilder, in their book, The Other Half of Church, discuss what they call 4 ingredients that make up good soil. And they are joy, attachment, love, group identity, and healthy correction. So we, I think, did... between our live streams and podcast, 8 videos about joy. And we're now in that second part where we're going to explore the idea of what is attachment love. So as you can imagine, love in our culture has several meanings. I mean, you can love your mom, you can love ice cream or pizza, and it's not the same thing.
No,
so I think
hopefully not.
Yeah, hopefully not. So I think it's important as we move forward talking about attachment love that we actually understand or have a common understanding of what that is. Now, last Sunday in your message on our live stream, you sort of kicked us off defining what it is. So maybe you could just give us sort of the highlights of that.
Yeah, so the Hebrew word hesed, and that's often translated as love.
Yep.
But it is difficult to capture the word hesed in a single word. You have to use adjectives and accompany it. Mm-hmm. And so when it's translated, it's often something like steadfast love, faithful love, enduring love, loyal love. And the closest Hebrew word then, when hesed, the word close to the Hebrew word hesed is the Greek word agape. And this is just keeping in mind that the Old Testament would have been originally in Hebrew, and the New Testament was recorded in Greek. So this is what's going on right when we talk about moving to agape, is that this was the New Testament writers kind of finding a word that closely resembled hesed.
Yeah, so I think just if you look up the definition, in Greek it's self-sacrificing love, but I know that if you look up the word agape just in the dictionary today, it's almost always used as divine love or God's love. So it's become very much a theological word. And in fact, even in Jesus' time, that word wasn't used very much until after Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And
his followers
started using it. Yeah. So I guess what we're trying to accomplish today is we are followers of Jesus. We want to follow Jesus' example. So we're kind of looking at the life and times of Jesus and just trying to find instances where he demonstrated or modeled attachment love for us. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is Jesus and his disciples.
That's right.
Now, Jesus' relationship with his disciples sort of went beyond teacher and student. Now, I did some research into this yesterday, and it was customary for a rabbi at the time of Jesus to have disciples actually live with them and learn their teachings, and by spending so much time with them, learn to emulate their character. But the way Jesus did it was a little bit different. So in order to understand it, we have to sort of understand the Jewish education system at that time. And there were sort of 3 levels, and sort of it started when you were a child. And all children, boys and girls, sort of did the first level. Then boys went on to do the second level. And then only kind of the smart or the well-to-do or connected people went on to do the third. And once you got to the third level, sort of the best and brightest from that graduating class went into what we would call ministry today. And they would appeal to a rabbi to take them on as a disciple. And quite often, rabbis at the time, I hesitate to say the word used, but they had this very superior, inferior kind of relationship where the rabbi expected his students to take care of him.
Right. There's a hierarchy.
Is a hierarchy. So he was the master, and the disciples would try and outdo each other in sort of serving the rabbi to try and gain favor with him.
Right.
Where in Jesus' case, he went around and chose his disciples. That was
Yeah.
strange to start with. 2, he chose people who had not completed the 3 levels of education, or we know that most of them did not, because they were common workers, people who became common workers after that second sort of education level for boys. They went into the workforce. And so, and then Jesus made it very clear that they were not there to serve him, but he was there to serve them. And,
Right.
and so a good example of that is Jesus washing his disciples' feet. And in John 13, chapter 13, starting at verse 12, Jesus says this: after washing their feet, he put on his robe again and sat down and asked, "Do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, because that's what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you." And then in another instance, I think the disciples were actually bickering about who was the greatest,
Yes.
which I think was a common, and you can see that from the culture of the day there.
Well, it is about that. I mean, like even going back to your explanation, talking about like the people would do things to
Yeah.
get his favor, to choose so that they could be under that rabbi. I mean, so there's still that sort of idea of like, okay, well, but which one of us is like, we know you chose us all, but which one did you choose more?
Yeah, exactly. And so Jesus gets his disciples together, and it's recorded in Matthew chapter 20, starting at verse 25. Jesus called them together and said, "You know the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you must become your slave. For even the Son of Man," that's Jesus referring to himself, "came not to be served, but to serve others and to give his life as a ransom for many."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he's definitely, you see that, and you see demonstrations of all of what it is that he wants, not just back and forth transfer of information, but like there's such a demonstration of that. So not only is he calling them to be servants, he modeled what it is to be a servant.
He showed them what it meant. And then getting back to the attachment love, which is really, I think we maybe get into this in the next video.
Yeah.
It really is sort of like a family bond is the closest way we could understand that.
Yeah.
And Jesus in Matthew 12 says this situation came up where Jesus' mothers and brothers came to visit him, and they couldn't get close to him because of the crowd. And it says, as Jesus was speaking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside asking to speak to him. Someone told Jesus, "Your mother and brothers are standing outside and they want to speak to you." And Jesus asked, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" Then he pointed to his disciples and said, "Look, these are my mother and brothers. Anyone who does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." So he's really making it very clear that the family bond is, or that there's a deep attachment beyond what was normal at the time between rabbis and disciples. He was trying to create a much deeper bond.
Yes. Yeah, and so then he does have that inner circle.
Yeah.
Because he does have many times where Jesus would refer to Peter, James, and John, and those would be those that would be seemingly the closest to him.
Yeah.
Even John is referred to the disciple Jesus loved. So obviously there's some kind of bond there that was important for John to refer to it that way.
Yeah, and what came to my mind was that as an example of that is that when Jesus is like hanging on the cross, he asked John to be responsible for his mother after his death, even though he had brothers. So as an oldest son, he was bestowing the responsibility that was normally reserved for family on someone he considered family.
Yeah, so I think we just really see that was a big deal. It's huge. Like the honor that John would have felt. Like, oh, this is how you are seeing me. You are seeing me as a brother.
Exactly. And then one other thing that came to mind with sort of the disciple group is that Jesus included people in his group of 12 disciples that a normal rabbi wouldn't even associate with. Yeah. So he had Simon the Zealot, who was sort of a, what would we call him? The word slips my mind. A zealot is like a freedom fighter kind of thing, right? He was trying to help the Jews fight against Rome. But the one that really stood out for me was when Jesus invites the tax collector Matthew to be one of his followers. And he kind of seals the deal by going to Matthew's house and eating with him and other tax collectors and sinners. And again, the Pharisees and rabbis of the time really take Jesus to task for this. And you can read that story in Matthew chapter 9.
Well, and I think it's big because we're talking about this idea of hesed and that's attachment. Quite often, we hear Jesus referred to as friend of sinners.
Yeah.
And with the idea of not just he hung out with sinners, he's friend of sinners.
Yeah.
That means he's working on attaching himself.
Yeah, attaching himself,
to these and trying to create hesed with again what he does with with a Matthew and things like that is a key of so many those kind of stories. And so the idea of friend of sinners is very much pointing to that. I'm not just sort of like we're acquaintances. You say hi, like he's a friend of sinners.
Yeah, I can be civil to sinners. I think
friendly to sinners.
I think as sometimes Christians we get we're known for the opposite. We're very exclusive. We only hang around with other Christians. And we might be friendly to people who aren't followers of Jesus, but we wouldn't form a deep attachment friend bond with them.
Right.
And obviously Jesus did. So, which is interesting. Another story that popped into my mind when I was thinking of this is Jesus healing the woman from the issue of bleeding. So in Luke chapter 8, we have this sort of interesting story where a woman has this sort of medical condition where she constantly bleeds. Now, it's hard for us to really understand how that's a problem, but in their culture, she would have been a complete outcast because once you touched something that was bloody, you became ceremonially unclean, which means you couldn't go to temple, you couldn't make sacrifices, which how they were forgiven of sin. So anyone who came into contact with her will also have to isolate themselves for a day and then take a bath in a river or lake. So that it'd be running water, not like a cistern, before re-entering daily life. So this woman was really an outcast. So she hears about Jesus. She knows that he heals people. So she devises a plan in her mind to get healed sort of on the sly. She's going to sneak through the crowd, touch Jesus' garment, and she believes she'll be healed and then just kind of disappear. And so she actually does that. She slips into the crowd. She touches Jesus' garment. She realizes, doesn't say how, but she instantly realizes she's being healed. And she thinks she's gone undetected, but Jesus realizes that something has happened. And he kind of stops, turns around and faces the crowd and says, "Who touched me?" And his disciples are going, "Who touched you?" I mean, there's a big crowd around. And in Luke 8, I just love how Jesus says this. He says, "Who touched me?" Jesus asked, and everyone denied it. And Peter said, "Master, this whole crowd is pressing up against you." But Jesus said, "Someone deliberately touched me, for I felt healing power go out of me." When the woman realized she could not stay hidden, she began to tremble and fell to her knees in front of Jesus. So she was afraid. And the whole crowd heard her explain why she had touched him and that she had been immediately healed. And what really stood out for me is how Jesus responded to her. He said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." So he refers to her as a close family member.
Well, I think that just kind of something that jumped out at me just as you were talking about that, you see such the very reality of such distress on this woman's face.
Yep.
And we've just recently been talking about joy and the relational joy
Yep.
being that idea of a face that's shining because it's happy to see you, happy
Yep.
to be with you. And here you wonder if the other thing is not only this daughter, but you realize the joy that's such an important part of agape or hesed or anything we're talking about with here is that in that moment she's feeling distress, probably shame, and in his response, this daughter, you have to believe on his face is the shining that I'm happy to be with you.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And she was ready to meet disdain.
Yeah.
And here she actually met joy.
So you see a roller coaster of emotion here.
Yeah.
She has this plan. She executes her plan. She gets healed. So she must feel joy at being healed. Mm-hmm. And then Jesus sort of calls her out, and now she's afraid.
Yeah.
And what's he going to say? I mean, from the reputation of the rabbis and Pharisees at the time, I think she expected to be admonished, right? And then Jesus, like you said, has that joyful look of looking at like your child and how much that would have brought her back from fear back to joy. And I thought that's a really good picture of everything we've been talking about. Okay, moving along here, we got Jesus' relationship with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So there's many instances recorded in the New Testament of Jesus hanging out with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So Jesus actually had close friends who were not sort of his disciple group, and he visited their house with the disciples. And I've often heard people say that he kind of took advantage of their hospitality a little bit. Here, I'm going to come and visit and bring my 12 friends. Can you make us dinner? Kind of thing, right? And that's, I'm sure they were happy to do it, but I'm sure it probably was an imposition if we think about if that would have happened to us today. And then we have that instance where in Luke 10, we see Jesus acknowledge Mary as a disciple, which again was not normal for women to be acknowledged this way. And he defends Mary to her sister Martha, who's kind of complaining about Mary not helping her prepare the meal for Jesus and his 12 friends. So then in John 11, the next chapter, we see that Lazarus is sick, and Mary and Martha send word for Jesus to come, expecting that he was going to heal Lazarus. Mm-hmm. Jesus was days away by traveling by foot, but he kind of delays for a couple of days before he comes. And if you think about it, that doesn't seem very loving at the time.
No.
But then he travels to see them, and his disciples are actually discourage him from even going back because they remind him that the Jewish leaders are out to either put him in jail or kill him. They've actually made threats, and they feel Jesus is putting himself in danger and them by going back to where Lazarus is, close to Jerusalem. And when he arrives, Jesus is confronted by Martha, who wants to know why Jesus hadn't come sooner because by now Lazarus has died. However, there's this beautiful sort of interaction between her and Jesus where she kind of blurts out her frustration, but then she acknowledges that he's the Messiah and that God will give him whatever he asks for. And then we see this beautiful scene where Jesus kind of weeps with the sisters, and then even the crowd is prompted to say that they recognize his great love for the family, but they question him taking so long to get there.
Sure.
But then Jesus does this huge miracle. He raises Lazarus from the dead. And that is really, if you look at the timeline of the story, this is really when it's sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back, that it starts the process of Jesus. So people go and report this, and that kind of solidifies it in the Pharisees' mind that they have to kill Jesus because he keeps doing all these miracles. And he goes into Jerusalem a few days later, and within a week he's dying on a cross. But again, that is all an act of self-sacrificing love. And then one last interaction with Mary and Martha is in John 12, where Mary anoints Jesus with expensive perfume. And the disciples start complaining about, this perfume could have been sold and the money given to the poor, because it was quite expensive, as we would understand it.
Yep.
And Jesus defends her and says, no, she's actually done something beautiful and wonderful for me. And wherever this story is told in the gospel story or my story is told, that this is going to be part of that story.
Yeah, and I think we can also look at that the story of the tax collector Zacchaeus,
Another tax collector.
and again that he's a shorter man and he wants to see what Jesus is about. He follows the crowd, but of course can't get a really good vantage point, so he runs ahead, climbs a tree, and Jesus, walking up to him, invites himself over to dinner, and this would have been frowned upon by Rabbi. I can't imagine what Zacchaeus is what's going on in his head at that moment, thinking the fact that he's a dressed Zacchaeus. My guess is that anyone in that sort of similar position is probably looking for an avoidance of eye contact more so than actually addressing him and then saying, hey, I'm going to come over to your house and give him that would have been considered such an honor to do that. And
as I understand it, Zacchaeus wasn't just a tax collector. He was sort of the boss of tax collectors.
Yeah, he was a
regional
big deal.
manager kind of thing. And over the course of having dinner with Jesus, there's the account of how Zacchaeus is transformed.
Yeah.
And he repents and makes these declarations about paying people back and not cheating and all this stuff. And I love how Jesus responds to that. In Luke 19:9, he says, salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. Now, tax collectors were actually excommunicated from the Jewish community because they worked on behalf of the Romans who were occupying their country. And it's hard for us to even understand what that is. The only thing I could come up with is it's as absurd as Jews in the 1940s working for Nazis.
Sure.
So, however, Jesus acknowledges Zacchaeus' change of heart and restores him to community by calling him a son of Abraham. So Jesus, again, shows love by being willing to sabotage his own reputation.
Yeah.
And again, in researching this, I came up with many, many, many more. There's the woman at the well in John chapter 4, the wedding at Cana, John 2. The rich young ruler came to mind, and some may think, well, how does that show agape? But in verse 21, and most of us miss this in Mark, it says, looking at the man. So before Jesus he has this kind of brief discussion. The guy asked how he can go to heaven, basically, or have eternal life. And Jesus says, follow the laws. And he says, I've done all that. What have I missed? And before Jesus responds, and we all know how he responds, and the guy kind of walks away sad, but it says, looking at the man, Jesus felt genuine love for him. So he's not responding out of harshness or you missed the point or whatever. He's in a loving way say, I know how bad you really want this, and this is what you're missing.
Right.
And then there's the Garden of Gethsemane, the Last Supper, and I just could go on and on. It's I think in reviewing this, it's pretty evident Jesus had deep bonds with the people he came into contact with.
Right. Well, that's what we want to leave you with today, and the idea of agape, the idea of love, but a bonded love, an attachment love. And so we just encourage you, as maybe you revisit some of these stories that we've talked about, or just even dive into some of these, just the many more that we didn't even get to that Ron was talking about. We just go through the Gospels and just take note of where you're seeing this agape shown by Jesus, this attachment that he's having towards people, and just like just make that note, just noting that this what Jesus is modeling in that. So we encourage you to do that over this next week or so. Thank you for joining us. We just hope that this can help us again grow in this understanding of what that we mean. We talk about attachment love, and how Jesus shows us how to do that. And we're going to have definitely some more videos that give us a little bit more context to the importance of this attachment love, this hesed. And so we just ask you to come back and join us. Please like and subscribe, because we want to keep doing more videos like this. If you have any comments, maybe even going further in what we've talked about in your own journey of understanding attachment love, please feel free to do that. If not, we will see you next week.